Welcome to The Beat. I'm Jason Johnson in for Ari Melber. We start with breaking news. Today, Donald Trump telling the Supreme Court he should get, quote, absolute immunity from prosecution. That's his official stance in the Jack Smith election case that is barreling towards a showdown at the Supreme Court. Trump doubling down on his team's prior claim that he can't be prosecuted even if he assassinated his political rivals.
Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is no.
Today, Trump's lawyers are arguing, quote, a former president enjoys absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for his official acts. They also try to argue that holding the president accountable for his crimes would somehow cripple the office. Quote, a denial of criminal immunity would incapacitate every future president with de facto blackmail and extortion. The key to Trump's argument is his claim that trying to overturn the election was part of his official acts as president, a claim that is absolute nonsense. Trump's filing comparing January 6 to Clinton's airstrikes in the Middle East, Bush's search for weapons of mass destruction, and even President Biden's handling of the border. I want to be clear, this is not about the presidency, this is about Trump. In recent days, he's made his true view of democracy abundantly clear to anyone who will listen.
If this election isn't won, I'm not sure that you'll ever have another election in this country. Does that make sense? I don't think you're going to have another election in this country if we don't win this election.
But it's near the end of today's brief that Trump's lawyers really go for broke, arguing that letting a president get away with his crimes is actually just baked into the Constitution. Quote, even if some level of presidential malfeasance were to escape punishment, that risk is inherent in the Constitution's design, adding, quote, the founders viewed protecting the independence of the presidency as well worth the risk that some presidents might evade punishment in marginal cases. This is dangerous and not true to the historical record. January 6th was not a marginal case, and the Constitution was designed to stop tyrants, not to protect them. Joining me now to discuss are two astute former federal prosecutors, Christy Greenberg and Renato Mariotti. Christy, I'm going to start with you. I'm galled by the audacity of this argument, but it seems to me that what the court may end up arguing over and what may be sort of the root of this is what constitutes an official presidential act. Is that really what this boils down to? Whether or not what the former president did on January 6th was part of his official duties?
Yes, based on the way that the Supreme Court framed the question presented, whether and to what extent a president enjoys immunity, I think that's exactly what they're going to do. And what Donald Trump says there is, okay, if you're not going to say that the standard is absolute immunity and you're going to start looking at perhaps the outer perimeter of a president's official acts, that's a fact-based analysis. And that needs to go back to the district court. And there needs to be fact-finding and delay. So in effect, he wins because that's the name of the game here. By the way, the D.C. Court of Appeals, they really, even though that was not the basis, that was not their standard, they observed that if you actually did look at Donald Trump's expansive definition of official acts, it doesn't cut it under the D.C. Circuit's own rulings. They basically said, if you, in other opinions, in the civil liability context, if you're an office seeker, not an office holder, the actions you're taking as the office seeker are not official acts. And they specifically said it is doubtful that all the types of conduct that are alleged in this indictment would constitute official acts. So if this does get sent down to the district court, I can't imagine that she's going to find the acts in the indictment are official acts, and it will just serve to delay the inevitable.
I got to ask you this because, Renato, this is also the part that sort of galls me in this. Is the Trump team arguing that simply investigating the 2020 election was the official act and they have no responsibility for January 6th? Like, what's the part of this where the former president's team is saying that his responsibility as a sitting office holder or office seeker ends and things out of his control should not be held accountable, or he should not be held accountable for them?
Yeah, it's very tricky. It's hard to see where the official act is here, right? The indictment alleges none of this was an official act. And at this stage of the proceedings, before we get to trial, those allegations are presumed true. And Jack Smith and his team should win at this stage. Christie's right that ultimately, depending on where the Supreme Court comes out, there very well may be a test that basically says for certain types of official acts or in certain contexts, perhaps there's some level of immunity, and for other types of official acts, there aren't. That's certainly a possibility. But it's hard to see what the official act is here because the federal government and executive branch has a very limited role in policing elections, okay, first of all. Secondly, they also have really, they're not part of the role. The role in the certification of January 6th, the role of the presidency is very limited. In fact, the vice president has essentially got a ceremonial role, as Judge Ludick counseled the vice president, and Vice President Pence ultimately found and followed that day. So it's really hard to see what Trump's role is here. As I think he essentially is going to have to say that the speeches he gave were part of his, essentially a ceremonial role as president, advocating and making it was political speech. But it's very hard to see him actually undertaking what we would think of as an official duty on or around that time.
And here's the other part. I'm going to put this on the full screen. Trump's brief argues that he took his official actions based on voluminous information available to President Trump in his official capacity, that the election was tainted by extensive fraud and irregularities. Christie, here's the thing. Even if we were to take this lying, multiple times indicted, twice impeached, even if we were to take him at his word, the investigation into all of those facts took place in the various lawsuits that Team Trump did throughout the country, investigating fraud. And they were found to have no credibility across the country. So he did investigate. He did engage in lawsuits, and those didn't work. And then he attacked the Capitol. Is that something that am I missing the connection here, or is he claiming that these things are somehow separate?
You're not missing anything. If anything, shame on Donald Trump's lawyers for putting this kind of an argument that has been a loser in every court that it's been tried in over 60 different lawsuits into a brief before the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, shame on them. At some point, you have to have some basis of good faith to believe that what you are saying as a factual matter is accurate. We have seen this game before, right? We've seen Sidney Powell get up there and say election fraud, election fraud. Well, where is she now? She pled guilty in Georgia. The same with Chesbrough. I mean, we've seen his lawyers go down this path. And so, again, there is no evidence. If there was evidence of election fraud, we would have seen it by now. And so the fact that this continues to come up is just incredibly disappointing that it's happening at this level.
I want to play this soundbite from last night, and I want to get your thoughts on the other side, Renato, because I think this is also indicative of not only the sort of ridiculous nature of these lawsuits, but how they're not really sitting well with the American public. I want to play this clip.
Former President Trump's lawyers said that Trump is unable to pay the $464 million bond in his New York civil fraud case. In his defense, how is a billionaire ever supposed to come up with $500 million? Come on. Do the math.
Trump's lawyers today told the court they can't find anyone to put up the $454 million bond he needs to cover what he owes the state of New York. They say they approached around 30 bond companies. None of them would do business. Well, gee, I wonder why. Can you imagine that call? Hi, we represent Donald Trump. We were wondering if you could... Hello?
Renato, nobody buys that he can't pay for this, right? And I'm surprised that usually Americans, like rich people, we're not really into, electing scrubs who can't pay their bills. But here's the question that I'm hit with. In the event that former President Trump can't come up with any of the money, what are the next steps? What are the consequences? Is someone going to put a boot on one of his planes? Are we going to see, FBI agents or city officials taking furniture out of his homes? What are the next steps if Trump is not able to make reasonable down payments on these fraud fees and fines that he has?
Well, what happens is essentially the New York Attorney General's office is going to start essentially collection proceedings. They're going to try to enforce that judgment. That's going to mean, for example, putting liens on properties that he has and trying to essentially obtain his interest in those properties. The reason I say his interest is because just like I'm not the only one who owns my home. The bank owns it. Whenever Trump owns various properties, there are lenders who also have an interest. So it's going to be complicated. It's going to take some time, and it's going to be costly for Trump, not only in terms of time and legal fees, but it's going to hurt his relationships with these lenders, and it's going to be messy because he's also got a court-appointed receiver and a monitor over him as well. So, my takeaway from Trump's inability to pay this $464 million or come up with a bond is either he didn't plan at all for the possibility that he could lose this lawsuit in which he took the fifth hundreds of times, which would seem to be a pretty foreseeable circumstance that he might lose this one, or he does not have the wealth that he has suggested that he's had for quite some time. I think that's probably the more likely result, or the more likely scenario.
I'm looking forward to seeing a Spirit of Halloween banner over Trump Tower if we can get that far. Christy and Renato, please stay with us.